Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture podcast on corporate social responsibility and ethics. In the past few weeks, we talked about the crisis of corporate governance, and we talked in the immediately preceding week, we talked about directors' duties. And our goal at this point is to try to draw a link between the crisis of corporate governance, directors' duties, and the idea about corporate social responsibility and ethics. And all of these three concepts are interrelated because when you talk about the crisis of corporate governance, as we said in the past, it is essentially because we have had a lot of instances when companies failed, huge companies have failed. So there were massive corporate failures, whether of banks or financial institutions, and during the global economic crisis in 2008 and 2010 in the United States, for example, the United States government had to intervene to bail out companies such as AIG Insurance, or it had to intervene to bail out Ford Motors Company and a lot of other companies, because these companies were too huge to fail. And they also intervened to invest money in some of the bigger banks. And the reason for this was that if these companies or banks were allowed to fail, it would have a cascading effect, a ripple-down effect that would lead to massive failures as well on the part of other companies. And so because they were too huge to fail, the government had to intervene. But that brought along the question that, during the good days, these companies were reaping the benefits of huge profits, huge bonuses, huge dividends for the shareholders. But when the bad times came, and the bad times came mainly because a lot of these companies had made very risky, speculative decisions, and some of these may actually have been as a result of some kind of corporate misbehavior. So in the good times, they were happy, but during the bad, it was the government stepping in, which meant it was citizens stepping in. And so therefore, we see that companies, when they operate, they have an effect on broader society. Because when they fail, it has a cascading effect because people lose jobs, employees lose jobs, they may lose their retirement funds, customers no longer have the company that they used to deal with, their products may no longer be serviced. There's a cascading effect because creditors may not get paid. And society suffers because there will be a lot of people out of jobs, including their families and so on. So we know on the one hand that there is an effect when companies operate and they fail, or when they make bad decisions. And at the same time, we know that it is society which will be forced to intervene to bail out companies that have failed. And we've seen this happening in Queensland when was it nickel mines as a result of one of the former members of Parliament who was accused of financial wrongdoing, and people lost jobs, and the Queensland state government had to intervene to help people, who lost their jobs and had to be paid part of the salaries that were no longer paid. So we know that not only is there significant impact on society, but because government has to intervene, what it essentially means is that it is taxpayers who then end up having to bail out certain businesses. And so it is very difficult, therefore, on the one hand, to argue that businesses should only be thinking about themselves. And that's an idea that we examine tonight, or at least in this lecture podcast, when you look at corporate social responsibility and ethics. And related to that, of course, is the question of what exactly are directors' duties? Because when we examine the study guide and the lecture podcast in the past 2 weeks, we said that directors under the law, both under the common law and the Corporations Act 2001, have a duty to act in good faith to promote the best interests of the company. And so the bigger question is, what exactly is the company? And I already highlighted in the previous study guides and the lecture podcast that when you speak about the company, remember that the company is a separate legal entity. So it can be argued that when the directors are meant to promote the interests of the company, it is the company and not necessarily the interests of the shareholders, who are distinct from the company. And so that is another aspect that we look at, because that is relevant also in relation to the idea of corporate social responsibility. And so tonight, or in this lecture podcast, after studying this topic, you should be able to discuss and explain the concepts of corporate social responsibility and stakeholders and legal and ethical duty. So when we speak of stakeholders, for example, these are people who have a stake in the company, even though they are not shareholders. So we draw a distinction between shareholders who own shares in the company and therefore part owners of a company by virtue of their shares, and stakeholders. So stakeholders are those who have stakes in the company, although they are not shareholders. So stakeholders can be employees, they can be creditors, they can be consumers, they can be broader society, it can even be the environment, and so on. So let's think about the idea of corporate social responsibility and the director's duty. So we said that directors have a duty to promote the interests of the best interests of the company. But whose interests are the interests of the company? Is it the company as a separate legal entity, or is it the shareholders who own the company? And conventionally, as we will see later on, or as I discussed in the past, I think, by convention or conventionally or traditionally, it is understood that when directors promote the interests of the company, they're meant to promote the interests of the shareholders. But some have raised the question that, how can that be if a company is really separate and distinct from the shareholders? And certainly, the interests of the company do not always converge or intersect with the interests of the shareholders who may just want dividends. And the company, on the other hand, is focused on its long-term viability or long-term survival. It also raises the question, can or should directors consider the interests of stakeholders? What actually happens when the directors decide to ignore the interests of stakeholders? So imagine a situation where a board of directors publishes a statement, or when asked in the media, do you consider the interests of stakeholders? Do you consider the interests of customers when you make decisions? Do you care about your employees? Do you care about the environment? And imagine the director saying, we don't care about stakeholders. We don't care about our customers. We don't care about, our creditors. Imagine the repercussions of that. And so therefore, we see that when companies make decisions, it is difficult for a company to just, or directors to just take around the lines of what their legal duties are, right? They have to consider, the repercussions, the marketing effects of any statements or actions they make, because while they may adhere to to something that is legal, what they do may actually be unethical, and it has a repercussion on companies. So a good example of this would be the case of the problem with that incident of Starbucks. I think some months back, where there had been two individuals who happened to be black in the United States, who were in Starbucks, and they were actually waiting for somebody to join them. They hadn't ordered, and the manager of Starbucks said, you're trespassing here, you haven't ordered anything. But because they got offended, they did not bother to order anything. And the manager decided to call the police, and the police arrested the two individuals because they hadn't ordered anything in Starbucks. Now, legally, the manager and Starbucks had the power and the right to eject these individuals because they had no business being there. But it had a very bad effect on the company. And the Starbucks CEO had to then publish a public statement saying that was the wrong thing to do. And I think we've had cases of airlines where, in the event of an altercation between the flight attendants and customers, when they roughly handled the passengers, it had a very bad effect on the company itself. Facebook, for example, may have argued that what they did was legal when they ended up harvesting a lot of information and data based on the activities of Facebook members. And while that may have been legal, in a sense, a lot of Facebook users felt that they were deceived by Facebook because without their knowledge or without their express consent, Facebook was using the information that they harvested from the activities of Facebook users in order to either sell Facebook users certain things or to be able to allow, let's say, companies like Cambridge Analytica to then make use of the information that they had from Facebook, perhaps to sway particular elections or to sway the attitudes of consumers towards certain products and so on. And so therefore, we see that activities may sometimes be legal, but it can be argued that those activities are unethical. And what might be considered to be ethical, however, may also turn out to be not really legal. And that's an idea. These are concepts which we're going to be examining in this lecture podcast. So let's just briefly examine the director's duties, both in the common law and under statute. So directors have a duty to act in good faith in the best interests of the company and for a proper purpose, to avoid conflicts between the interests of the company and directors' personal interests, to exercise care and diligence, and to prevent the company trading while insolvent. So these are the core legal duties of directors. So there are legal duties imposed by law. If directors fail in these legal duties, they will be held legally responsible. They can be held. They can be made to pay damages. They can even be held criminally liable. They can be made to disgorge profits which they unlawfully acquired, and so on. So these are directors' legal duties. So what we're going to do in the context of the debate on corporate social responsibility is to focus on directors' fiduciary duties, to act in good faith in the best interest of the company and for a proper purpose. The idea really is that if you're going to be acting in a fiduciary duty, you owe somebody a duty of loyalty and good faith. So it's not like it's not like an ordinary transaction where you ask somebody to act in your behalf. That person whom you appoint, doesn't really owe you a duty to act in good faith or to really be loyal to you. It's just a straightforward transaction. But the idea of a fiduciary duty is that when you accept certain duties, you actually owe a duty to be acting in good faith and to be loyal to the person who appointed you. And so the idea then is that directors have a fiduciary duty to the company to act in good faith in the best interest of the company and for a proper purpose. But the bigger question for us is, what does it actually mean when we talk about directors acting in the best interest of the company? That is the crucial question there. So whose interest must directors promote? Are the interests of a company the same as the interests of shareholders? Can or should directors consider the interests of stakeholders? Can directors ignore the interests of stakeholders? So let's begin again with a reminder that because of the case of Solomon versus Solomon and the idea of the theory of separate legal personality, we know that the company has a legal personality that is separate and distinct from that of the shareholders. So it's not possible to say that the company and the shareholders are one and the same because of the theory of separate legal personality. That is a very basic legal concept in company law. So when therefore it is understood that directors have a fiduciary duty to promote the interests of the company, does it mean the interests of the company as a separate legal entity or the interests of the shareholders? However, the conventional, as I've said, the well-accepted view is that that particular legal duty actually means that when directors promote the interests of the company, they must promote the interests of shareholders. That is the accepted view. But there are a lot of individuals who question whether or not that is in fact a correct interpretation of the legal principle. So we're going to go back to that debate in a short while. And when we examine the idea that directors must promote the interests of the company, or by extension, the interests of the shareholders only, or the interests of the shareholders, would it mean that directors can ignore the interests of stakeholders? And we will recall that when a company does badly, and especially when a company fails, it has very adverse effects that affect people outside of the company. Creditors may not get paid, suppliers may not get paid, society may end up having to pay for the benefits of people who've lost their jobs, and employees who don't own the company will lose their jobs. And so on the one hand, when a company fails, a lot of people, are affected adversely, and which is why you talk about corporate governance, because if you have certain duties, you necessarily must have responsibilities. And we know that we've had a lot of cases when the government, and therefore the taxpayers, have had to step in and intervene to bail out companies. So it is really specious for a company to just say, our legal duty is really just towards ourselves or our shareholders, because we know that whatever their actions are have an effect on broader society. So, but what it tells us is that, on the one hand, when in relation to looking at directors' duties, can you really just talk in terms of legal duties, or can you talk as well in terms of ethical duties? So that when you speak of ethical duties, it means that it is not a legal duty in the sense that you can be compelled under the law to do something, meaning somebody can sue you in court or compel you to, by an action in court, to do something. Sure, it's not a legal duty, but there is an ethical duty. I mean, I think we all agree there's such a thing as ethics in society, right? We don't always act on the basis of what the law says. We can act on the basis of social norms, like social conventions. So people in general do not act simply because of a desire to obey the law. We do certain things because we think it is the right and ethical thing to do. And the right or ethical thing to do may be a result of religion. It may be a result of societal values and so on. It may be a result of our internal moral compass. But we know that we don't act simply on the basis of the law. So, a simple question of, not cutting, when there's a queue, you don't just cut somebody off. You don't just blow your car horn when you don't like it, because that's rude. You don't go to the mall, in your underwear. It's probably not illegal, but it's probably unethical. And so in anyone's actions, you don't just look at actions on the basis of what is the law, but whether or not what you do is actually ethical or not. Questions about should you take care of your parents when they're old? It's not a legal question, but it is an ethical question. So we realize in society that there are such things as legal and ethical duties, which brings us to the question of corporate social responsibility. The idea being that companies owe a responsibility not only to their shareholders, but also to stakeholders. And so therefore companies have a social and environmental responsibility in addition to their economic and financial responsibility towards their shareholders. So there is now the idea of CSR, corporate social responsibility. The companies cannot just think, or directors therefore cannot just think in terms of what is good for their shareholders, but they have a responsibility to think of stakeholders. They have a responsibility to think about social and environmental responsibilities. So, companies must make sure that they don't pollute the environment, not because it is illegal, but because they have an obligation to make sure that they don't damage the environment, because they cannot be killing birds and so on. They have an obligation perhaps to think about global, climate change, that, if you keep on going at the rate we are of having anthropogenic gas emissions, and the use of fossil fuels, at some point, our the many generations after us will live in an inhabitable land. So that's the idea that companies, you cannot just think of companies in terms of what's good for their shareholders, but also what's good for the broader society and stakeholders. And Archie Carroll, who has been talking a lot about corporate social responsibility, identifies that there are four components or four aspects of corporate social responsibility: economic responsibilities, legal responsibilities, ethical responsibilities, and discretionary responsibilities. And the idea is that, at its core, a company has a duty to produce economic returns for the investors or the shareholders. Because without this responsibility, then there is no reason for any investor to invest in a company or buy shares. And without the investments from capitalists, where will a startup have money in order to start operating as a business? Or where will companies get capital for the purpose of expanding and undertaking business risks? So there is a recognized, first and foremost, is the idea that companies have an economic responsibility, and to make sure that they produce goods at a profit. It's also the idea that companies have certain legal responsibilities. So when it comes to trying to generate a profit, they have to do so within the framework of law. So they have to comply with their responsibilities, not just under the company law, but also in terms of employment law. So that you have to make sure that you don't practice discrimination, you don't practice sexual harassment in the workplace. You have to follow occupational health and safety issues. You have to follow rules concerning consumer guarantees. You have to follow the rules on contracts. You have to avoid the commission of torts and so on. So apart from the economic responsibilities, companies also have legal responsibilities. But at the same time, we know that society has certain expectations on companies, so that companies do have an ethical responsibility. Companies, for example, cannot argue that, oh, in some countries, it's legal for us to, just hit striking workers on the head or even have them shot. After all, we're not the ones doing the killing. It's the company doing it, or we've hired somebody. It's the government that has a policy that if there are striking workers, they can just be mowed down by guns and so on. That's not possible, because it might be legal, you might get away with it under the law, but you have an ethical responsibility. Or you can say that, oh, but it's legal for us to be employing child workers. Sure, it might be legal, but you do have an ethical responsibility not to exploit children, or maybe not to exploit women and so on. So at least for many of us who are trying to do our best to stick to our proper moral compass, we know that we can't operate in society solely on the basis of what is required by the law. There are certain ethical responsibilities and certain ethical expectations, and there are certainly ethical responsibilities. So now the fourth dimension of corporate social responsibility is the idea of discretionary responsibility. So in this particular case, when you talk about discretionary or voluntary or volitional responsibilities, it's really not often clear what the expectation of society might be. What it means is that it can be a very gray area. So it is up to the business to do this or that. So if a business decides to support same-sex marriage as a social cause, maybe that's fine. If a business decides not to support industries that engage in that deal with casinos, or those companies that sell cigarettes, or might encourage gambling, or might encourage drinking, maybe that's kind of a discretionary responsibility. It's not too clear cut, because it can be said that casinos on the one hand may be bad, but they're also good because the profits they generate can be fed back to society and so on. So those are discretionary responsibilities. So I've just articulated with you that when you talk about responsibility, you don't just talk about the economic responsibility or legal responsibility. There's an idea that there are also ethical responsibilities and discretionary responsibilities. So therefore, when a company undertakes certain actions, or when the directors make decisions, you can measure their level of responsibility by asking, are they just complying with their economic responsibilities, which is just the most basic? Are they complying with their legal responsibilities? Are they taking further steps to fulfill certain ethical responsibilities? Or are they even taking the step when it is discretionary, it is volitional, but they're doing a good thing when they do this or that? So it could be Starbucks deciding that they're never going to be ejecting people who don't order food in the store. That's kind of discretionary. You can't really say that Starbucks has an ethical responsibility to allow people there even if they're not buying food. You can't argue that, because if you allow that, you'll have customers, people sitting in stores doing nothing and buying nothing, and the business will fail. But that was a discretionary responsibility. So it's just one way of us looking at the idea of what corporate social responsibility can mean. Now, there are actually three ways of or views of CSR. one is known, and the basic is known as the shareholder primacy theory, and it is what is traditionally known to be the very conservative view of corporate social responsibility. And the theory is that the company should simply be managed in pursuit of the interests of the shareholders in order to maximize their income and wealth. There can be no argument about that, because, as we said, if shareholders cannot be made happy by getting returns for their investment, then there can be no capitalism. There will be no capital to finance the ventures, the business ventures, and so on. So it makes sense to talk about shareholder primacy theory, which means that it is shareholders who are mainly the beneficiary of any decisions on the part of the company. But there are those who argue that if all a business does is to think in terms of its shareholders, that is a very narrow and kind of a very irresponsible view, because, as we said, actions of companies do have an effect on society. It does have an effect on stakeholders, or those who are not shareholders. And so therefore, companies, according to the stakeholder theory, have an obligation to stakeholders, so that a company must be managed not only for the interests of shareholders, but also for stakeholders. And there is a third argument, in the sense that, according to the enlightened shareholder value theory, the theory is that when a company actually tries to think in terms of the stakeholders, ultimately that would benefit shareholders. So a company that says, oh, we want to make sure that we take good care of our customers, we want to make sure that we take good care of the environment, we take good care of society, and so on. Of course, in that case, they will establish a very good reputation and probably be able to expand their customer base, and their customers are going to be very happy. So in doing so, that adds to the market value of the company, that adds to the market share, and of course, in the process, that redounds to the benefit of the shareholders themselves. So that's being enlightened. That's the enlightened shareholder values theory. So trying to promote the interest of stakeholders is actually an enlightened view, because it does redound to the benefit of shareholders in the end. But let's put ourselves in a situation where a company, for example, is losing money, and it may be required. So let's assume that a company has 2 plants in 2 various places, and it decides that one approach would be to shut down one of the plants. But in doing so, because the effect would be if you shut down a particular plant, it will mean that there will probably be about 500 individuals who will lose their jobs. And it will probably mean, because that plant is located in a town that is heavily reliant on the plant, it will mean that there is an effect on that particular, in that particular town. The town may even die. So the question then, in that case, should the company, for example, given a choice, that it's either you continue to operate at a loss and therefore you possibly endanger the viability of the entire company, or should you shut down that particular plant in order to save money and perhaps save the company? And this is a debate that goes on when Holden decided to shut its operations in Australia and go elsewhere. It's just a business decision. Or it could be about instances when companies in Australia engage in offshore operations, so that because they feel that salaries or wages in Australia are quite high, then they operate service centers, maybe in India or maybe in the Philippines and so on. But that's a business decision. But then you have to ask, what about those instances when it's really a matter of choice, that you can't have both? So that if you promote the shareholders' interests, what it essentially means is you're actually disregarding the stakeholders' interests totally. Or if you promote the interests of stakeholders, you're totally disregarding the interests of shareholders. So I'll give you an example. Let's assume that I may have raised this before. Let's assume that there's a pharmaceutical company that has created a life-saving drug. And according to studies, after they've done a lot of testing, and they're actually ready to release the drug, the studies show that if the drug is released within 1 year, it is likely to save about, let's say, 5 million lives. But for the company to release the drug straight away, without locking in the markets and making sure that their patents are protected, without making sure that they've really created an extensive network of distributors, what will then happen is that the company will only be able to maybe earn profits in terms of $10 million. But they would save 5 million lives. On the other hand, if the company, if the directors decide to delay the release of the product, to lock in the market, protect its legal interests and so on, they would generate $1 billion in profits. But what it would mean is that there'll be 5 million individuals killed each year. The question is, if you were the director, what would you do? Whose interests would you promote? Would you promote the interests of the shareholders so that by delaying the release of the drug, you end up with $1 billion in dividends after 5 years? Or do you promote the interests of the stakeholders? By releasing the drug early, you don't get a lot of money, but you save lives. It's not often an easy question, and it is a question, arguably, that can't simply be answered according to the law, right? There are ethical dimensions to it. And in one of the discussions I had, not sure if it was with Brett, the point taken was that if it comes out that a company or its directors made decisions solely on the basis of what the law requires, chances are, if the public finds out, there was going to be backlash. If the media finds out, there is going to be backlash. So oftentimes, these types of decisions are not really easy to make. So whose interest should directors promote? The corporation, shareholders, or stakeholders? According to the law, it should be the corporation, then by extension, shareholders. But again, as we said, these are decisions that are easy to make, because if a company ignores completely the interests of stakeholders, there can be hell to pay. And it can also mean that there are certain ethical duties that are likely to be breached, certain societal expectations that the company is likely failing to meet, and there will be repercussions for that. So these are things that we should be thinking about. And so with that, after studying this topic, you should be able to discuss and explain the concepts of corporate social responsibility and stakeholders, and legal and ethical duties. And with that, thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye.